ADHD people can have what we would call superpowers or sort of positive side, but then sometimes I go, yeah, but there's also things that are really difficult.
The extreme at the sort of end of gentle challenges is more ingrained in personality. And then at the more challenging end, that's when people need support and extra help. And there isn't a set point for that.
There's some sort of calming co-regulatory effect of doing something that's ritualized and formalized. It's in a group, but it's not chaotic.
Some of the people I know that go to hot yoga, some of them lose awareness of body.
If you have ADHD and you're not exercising, I'm like, don't complain to me. Don't come to therapy. Like that should just be like, come on, basic. Okay, today's episode is on ADHD and embodiment. It's with me and Dr. Helen. Helen, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So ADHD, let's talk a little bit about our personal journeys. Maybe let's define it first of all. You've got a good definition, Helen? Sometimes you hear ADD and various variations on it. What's your sense of what it is? And then we'll talk about our personal side and then how embodiment affects it, and maybe some practical things to anyone who's got ADHD out there.
Well, it's interesting because the definition and the labeling and the names have changed over time. So at one point, I would have said a neurodevelopmental disorder, and now it's much more sort of neurodevelopmental differences. So
Yeah.
diversity in neurodevelopment with challenges in attention, impulses, hyperactivity, and emotional regulation.
It's interesting, isn't it? And we've seen this across the board. So there's this idea of sort of more philosophically, there's a postmodern idea that nothing's better or worse than anything else, right? There's the
Yeah.
postmodern sort of idea. There's, who said it's good or bad? Who says don't should me? You'll kind of hear this sort of destruction of the better or worse scale in kind of society, and often well-meaning, coming from this sort of Christian idea that we're all equal under God, we're all equal souls, and that's become sort of we're all completely equal. And there's some good in this, isn't there? Because it's like, ADHD people can have what we would call superpowers or sort of positive side. But then sometimes I go, yeah, but there's also things that are really difficult for me as someone with ADHD. That like we can call them challenges rather than disorders, but they're not fun and they can mess up my life. So this is quite a serious, like impulse control can end up, it can put you in jail. I
Yes.
know it never put me in jail, but it certainly kind of gave me some adventures and experiences that maybe weren't wise, let's say. I remember someone having a disagreement with someone and they were just like, right, sometimes you just say too much what you think, you just blurt stuff out, people get upset, and I'm like, yeah, it causes chaos in my life sometimes, man. So it's like I also want to acknowledge that yes, the goalposts change, they become a bit more politically correct. I don't know if they're more accurate or not, but there's real like problems there. Certainly challenges feels a little bit like, say, this isn't a problem, this is just a challenge, like some sort of American life coach kind of hitting it up. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a range and the sort of clinical edge.
Yeah.
So part of this links into personality. So if at the extreme at the sort of end of gentle challenges is more ingrained in personality, and then at the more challenging end, that's when people need support and extra help. And there isn't a set point for that. And there are
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
each issue that you face isn't at a set point for that either. But regardless, the wiring is a bit different. The underlying wiring, the software, the wiring, the hardware, the software,
The
the
hardware, yeah.
wiring is different.
I mean, this is what gets into what causes ADHD, and this is where people get controversial. We'll just briefly talk about this. So, I mean, in terms of wiring, there does seem to be a genetic difference. If I look at, I used to work with a lot of children, and we always used to play certain games like spot the ADHD kid, spot the gay kid, spot the smart, like there'd always be certain, you could sort of see in a class of 30 kids, there would be some differences. And when you talk to mums with more than one kid, this is, I think, really strong anecdotal evidence is they'll often go, yeah, they were just born different. And you could
Yes.
say, well, I mean, there's often a sort of very left-wing argument that we're a blank slate and it's all society, and that's very hopeful, but the evidence doesn't really show that scientifically. And when you speak to mums with more than one kid, they're just like, no, no, I try and treat them the same. Of course, it's not exactly the same if it's a second child or whatever, but it just seems like my niece and nephew, for example, they're so different. They're so different.
Yeah,
So there seems to be a genetic component there.
definitely.
Definitely, it seems to be a thing, right? Like we can, maybe we could chat GPT what chat GPT reckons is the genetic component, but it's certainly some for most sort of mental things, it's 50%, for a lot of things like depression or schizophrenia. So I imagine it'd be similar. Um, yeah, and then we've got the environmental things, right? Some people say it's a result of certain types of toxicity or certain things in the environment, the cultural environment. Are we training children in a certain way? So like that adds to it. I kind of sometimes feel like saying technology has made everyone ADHD. I got so many friends that can't read a book now.
Yeah. So there are layers of different things there, aren't there? So there is a definite genetic link. And I think it's a lot higher than that. I think it's even 60, 70% for people
Right.
with clear ADHD. But also, some people with trauma present very similarly to people with ADHD. Some people with the ADHD also had trauma. And then the layering of society, like the fast tech and everything happening, means that everybody's nervous system's a bit different and everybody's being trained a bit differently. So it's
Right.
not just one of those things. It's a series of things.
Yeah, yeah. And I was going to say actually bring in trauma next, but it's if we took at anyone from 100, 200 years ago, they would regard us all as ADHD.
Yes.
Like there was a piece I heard recently, which I think it was 100, years ago. There was some speeches done by American politicians before an election, and each speech was, I think, 4 hours long. And they each did a speech, and then they came back the next day for comments, and people would stay for like a debate that was like 8 hours.
Yeah.
The average person could focus on that.
Yeah.
And so I think our attention has changed a lot over the years as a society because of tech and the way cultures move. And as you say, trauma is also a big factor here. And I've
Yeah.
heard people, Gabor Maté, whatever, say that all ADHD is trauma. I'm like, he thinks everything's trauma. I wouldn't go that far. But it's certainly hyperarousal symptoms from trauma. There's a kind of Venn diagram there. They look like ADHD. They could be part of, I think, made my, what I noticed is this: when I addressed my trauma, my ADHD got better.
Yes.
But it didn't totally go away. And I feel like I've addressed a lot of my trauma at this point.
Yeah.
Many cycles of therapy and EMDR and different things. Like I don't feel particularly traumatized. I don't have PTSD anymore, definitely not. But I still have some, like maybe 50% of the ADHD symptoms I used to have.
Yeah, and some people with ADHD never had any trauma. They didn't have any trauma. And
Yeah.
some would say there is a myth about having a beautifully happy childhood, but I would disagree. I would say some
Some
people.
people just had a good childhood. The
Yeah.
same, I go to AA meetings, right? Alcoholics Anonymous. And in addiction, most people have trauma in addiction. But you get the odd person, like 1 in 10, 1 in 8, they just go, no, my childhood was lovely, didn't have any abuse, I had a really nice middle class childhood. And it's like, oh, you just get the odd one that's got the gene for kind of, alcoholism or whatever. And it doesn't seem to be, I think trauma can make that worse. It can
Yeah.
add a level of hyperarousal, for example, or a level of numbing that addiction, people try to get through. Okay, so in terms of personal stories, then you're not ADHD, right, Helen? You have no diagnosis, as far as I know?
I have no diagnosis. There is a strong neurodevelopmental thread running in the genes of my family. So
So
my
your family are full of spackers, right? Lots of neuroatypicality in your family.
loads of it, loads of it.
Loads of
So
it.
whenever I say something like, "Oh, I've got really interested in this and I've bought 16 of them and now I'm developing this," one of my kids will go, "Really?" And that particular child has ADHD and autism and is absolutely convinced that I have both because of their experience looks similar to mine, but not at the level of challenges that would meet a clinical threshold.
Yeah, and this is the problem now is that there's lots of people that have got TikTok diagnosis,
Yeah,
and there is a threshold because they are just like I do OCD things sometimes, right?
yeah,
When I get stressed, I sometimes buy more food than I really need, and you could say it's hoarding behavior, or I'm a bit addictive around this or that, but
yeah,
things aren't always clinical, that kind of level. And in some ways, that maybe the cutoff point is artificial, but we do sort of need one
yes.
particularly in the modern era. I think it's overdiagnosis, like ADHD and autism combo. What's that called now? It's got its own name.
Ow, AUDHD.
Yeah, it's so hot right now. The
Yeah.
kids love it. I mean, it was also a way for white kids to claim victim status very quickly, right? Like if you don't want to go full trans, it's the sort of way to kind of claims, I'm going to be on the rainbow flag next year. Apparently, they're going to add neuroatypical to the flag. So I'm one of the rainbow people next year. So, there's a certain cachet in that now. People are getting offended and blah, blah, blah. This sort of battle for who's the real victim, like, and I remember when I started hearing like in people in workshops, they'd introduce themselves by saying they had ADHD. And I go, you know what? It doesn't define my personality. And I do have a clinical diagnosis. I basically had it all through childhood very clearly. I couldn't sit still in school. I'd hyper focus on certain things, but struggle with other things. My behavioral control was very bad, particularly once I hit puberty. Inhibition was always a problem for me. But then I sort of, I basically self-medicated at first with a lot of martial arts, like that discipline. This is where we get into the embodiment side.
Yeah.
And I certainly never defined myself that way or tried to sort of claim status that way. I just knew that once I did martial arts, it was really good for me. And I couldn't actually meditate at first. Paul Linden used to call me the Energizer Bunny because I was so hyperactive. And it wasn't till I
That
did some martial.
surprises me.
Yeah, yeah. Now I've calmed down a bit. But partly that's getting older, getting tired and haggard. But partly it's I did a lot of embodied practice that gave me discipline and boundaries and was essentially a regulation strategy. And I couldn't meditate at first because sometimes meditation is very difficult for ADHD people because their mind is
Yeah.
just a box of frogs. It's just too stressful, too. The same when I tried to teach meditation in Sierra Leone with very traumatized people years ago before I realized this. It's just too much. Their mind is not a fun place to be. They're just too
Yeah.
agitated. But once I'd done a lot of physical exercise, plus the sort of boundaries and the ritual of martial arts, then I started meditating. And I think that's been very helpful for me from a sort of regulation point of view. I only got the diagnosis later in life when my niece was getting a diagnosis because schools are much better in the UK now. And that,
Yeah.
opens up certain people say, oh, don't label kids and stuff, but it can be good for like getting them like educational support of different types, accommodations of different types, and to sort of make her feel better because she was worried about it. I got one too. And then she was like, okay, well, it's not such a big deal. I went, I got a
Yeah.
private. You have to wait several years in the UK for a diagnosis now. There's such a backlog of people thinking they've got it. But
Yeah.
I just paid 50 quid, I think, for a private appointment, had an hour-long interview. Actually, I did get a questionnaire once at the doctor's, and I got bored. The questionnaire was so long, I got bored of halfway through and drew some pictures on it. And I think that should be the ADHD test. If you can complete the questionnaire they give you, because it's so bloody long, you don't have ADHD. If you get bored and draw pictures of it and, walk out in a hump, then that's the ADHD diagnosis. So, part of my story as well, sorry to go on, was also that I tried various kinds of medication. I tried herbal medication, which was quite good for me. I enjoyed that. And then later on, I took various kinds of medications. A lot of them are surprisingly amphetamine based. And I
Okay.
found, unfortunately, that meant my sleep was worse quality. And there was two main problems. One, I would actually get sometimes more impulsive on the drugs because you're quite high.
Yeah.
Eventually, I moved to Wellbutine, which was a non-amphetamine one. And there was definitely a time in my life where I was making bad decisions based on the fact that I was a little bit high, effectively on amphetamines every day.
Yeah.
And I felt like a genius while I was on it. Your mind is razor sharp. I can see why people in tech and stuff take them. But I wasn't convinced I was actually making better decisions. I think I just thought I was. I had this
Yeah.
sort of confidence and a sharpness of thought. I remember being in account meetings with my accountants going, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this will save money. And it was a bit manic. And
Yeah.
there is this sort of paradoxical effect for people with ADHD, but I found that if I got the dose wrong, I was a bit manic. And also when they wore off at night, I would just crash.
Yeah.
I found them very strong medicine. And when they wore off, I sometimes remember like lying on the floor, not being able to move. One time I got the timing wrong and it wore off, and I was on a sort of late evening coaching call, and I just couldn't be bothered to coach the client anymore. And I was really rude to that client. And I like lost that client, lost like 10K worth of coaching. And I was like, oh, this is quite pokey. I know for some people they're a lifesaver, but I would say don't, just as an embodiment teacher who feels the impact on the body, they are strong medicines. And to not take that lightly for you, whether you're giving them to kids or for yourself.
So much in all of that, Mark. And it's really good to hear your story and your experience. The diagnostic labeling is really important. And you raised something there about there being a point of support. And for me, the labeling is about what it will support somebody with. So,
Right.
for example, one of my kids has autism. He's autistic, and we didn't have a diagnosis all through his childhood because we knew that was just him, and the school knew that was him. It was just him as he was. But we went through the process before university because he needed that for the right supports, and the same
Right.
applies to ADHD. So it's a communication tool in that way. And the TikTok diagnosis is a bit of a problem because people are self-diagnosing because things can look the same. It doesn't mean that diagnoses previously were calibrated at the right point. I think lots of people were missed, but it's about having a reason for this for that labeling to help people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the treatment, the amphetamine-based treatment, as you say, first of all, you can have the opposite effect, or you can have a really alerting, overstimulating effect. But those drugs will make everybody more alert. They will make everybody sharper. So it's the drugs can't be used as a diagnostic tool either, and that's what some people
Have you
think.
heard
Oh,
about
it
Nazis
helps.
on meth? You know, the Nazis were all on meth
Oh,
when they invaded France, for example, and they were like, tank drivers awake for 3 days. You know, it's one reason they. As some people say, it's the reason for the Blitzkrieg success. I mean, I wouldn't go that far historically, but there's some historical examples of pilots have been given pet pills for years
yeah,
involving these
yeah,
kind of things, right?
yeah,
So, I mean, but they are really strong, and actually, the Germans, for example, stopped using them because they just found that people crashed and burnt out
yeah,
on them, and honestly, I think there's still an impact on my nervous system from the
yeah.
2 or 3 years that I was on them. It's a few years back now. And I kind of, part of me goes, I'm not sure that was a good idea, A, for the life choices I was making then, and
Yeah.
B, for the burnout of the nervous system afterwards. I
Yeah.
worry about kids. I mean, you're more qualified than me on this, obviously, but I worry about the long-term impact on nervous systems.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And there's an immediate effect, but the longer term impact wasn't really known because they weren't being prescribed like that. And actually, you said about the embodiment, and so people developing, some people will always need extra support through medications and things, right? But looking at the embodiment and the awareness of our own embodiment, or somebody with ADHD with their embodiment, and finding ways to train their own nervous system, to shift their own nervous system, to develop their own nervous system, as you described you did. You found early on, whether you needed the medications or not, you still found that the martial arts, the Aikido, made a difference.
Huge difference. And
Yeah,
let's come back to why, because I think the reasons aren't obvious, right? So for one of it's just exercise. Like kids do not get enough exercise. Exercise, like I used to have teachers who would let me go for a walk in the middle of class, thank God, just to kind of burn off some of that energy. And I think little kids, particularly little boys who have a higher diagnosis than girls on ADHD, um, just need to burn it off. They need that exercise. So, and even now I do my coaching calls walking because I can focus better when I'm walking and I talk to my client, get my steps in, which is great for health, but it's also so I can not fidget, you know,
yeah,
rather than sitting staring at a Zoom screen for 3 hours a day, which would kill me. So one is just exercise. The second one is the self-regulation techniques you learn. And I think as well as maybe medication as an option, we're crazy that we don't offer self-regulation tools to kids with ADHD. Like, and it's a lot harder than writing a prescription because it might be an 8 week course. It might be joining karate class. My nephew, I think, has got a bit of it's joined a karate class, and it seems great for him. So I think that yeah, the exercise, but also the sort of self-regulation side of things. And then lastly, there's a ritualistic side of things. So I've always enjoyed that in sort of Catholic Church, for example. There's a sort of call and response. There's a sort of a flow that you can recognize. And martial arts has that you all bow together, you're in a uniform. There's some sort of calming, co-regulatory effect of doing something that's ritualized and formalized. It's in a group, but it's not chaotic, right? It's something you do in a group which has got a set thing you all do that you can kind of that's co-regulatory in a way people might not realize. People think of co-regulation as just empathy, and yeah, it's great to blab around and have a counselor listen to you. But I think that ritual side is another thing. What do you think?
yeah, I agree with you. I think that ritual side is really important. And it also brings like an earthy structure as well, a framework to approach. life. You know, many people with ADHD, they live in looking around, they live in utter chaos. And I know my friends that have got ADHD, they live in a chaos that they don't necessarily like. So it's okay to have
Yeah.
a chaos you like and embrace and you know where everything is. But when the ADHD is sort of in charge of them rather than the other way around, the chaos gets out of control. And that structure coming back, and ritual is part of that. Even the
Yeah.
ritual in the day, structure across the day, ritual in activities. Yeah.
I mean, organizing your environment, I've seen this with autistic people. I've seen this with ADHD people, like organizing your environment. You may create chaos, but then you organize it and it starts to regulate your nervous system via the environment. And I think, like, Jordan Peterson's now cliched, tidy your room. It's actually not a bad place to start. You know,
Yes.
it's actually not a bad place to start when you're stressed. It's like organize your physical environment, then your mental environment gets together. Obviously, we talked about how movement helps thinking. I think that's the same for everyone, but particularly for ADHD people. The other aspect I think is pretty interesting from an embodiment point of view is sometimes ADHD people have difficulty with interoception, right? And even exteroception. For me, there's a sensitivity in the environment to noise, for example, like beeps are particularly annoying and loud noises. It's a real problem for me in certain places I've lived. And, like when I lived in a house next to a building site, it just exhausted me. And understanding what makes me tired because of the perception stuff has been really helpful for me.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that ADHD people may struggle with interoception. Yeah, I think actually training that through embodiment training, like now I'm pretty aware of my breath rate, my heart rate. I think I got into embodiment not because I was talented, but precisely because I wasn't talented, because I
Yeah.
wasn't so good at interoception. And it's definitely helped me to go, oh, look, I'm agitated. Oh, look, I'm accelerating.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
So interoception, for those that don't know, how am I on the inside? How am I? What are the bodily sensations on the inside? What is my breath? What is my internal, what sensations are appearing? Is that hunger? Do I need to go to the loo because they're overridden or they're just ignored? And not just in ADHD, of course, but it can be particularly problematic in ADHD. And part of that, you mentioned exteroception and sensory perception. So, sensory processing, there are big differences for people with neurodiversity, both ADHD and autism.
Yeah.
And that might be, and understanding your own sensory sensitivities, it can be really helpful in planning your environment, planning your day, because you may be very sensory sensitive in certain areas.
Yeah, like with my niece, it's like she can't stand like labels on her clothes, whereas for me,
Yeah,
it's more sound. So for her,
yeah,
like my sister's just really careful what clothes she buys her because she knows certain fabrics annoy her.
yeah,
Whereas for me, that's not like a primary concern, but I'll never leave the house without my noise reduction headphones, for example.
yes,
Like for
yeah.
me, that's just like I'd be like the idea of like taking a flight through Heathrow without my noise reduction headphones horrifies me as an idea. Um,
And if you are sensitive like that, it's not just the unpleasant nature of that sensory input, but it's exhausting to your nervous system to experience it for prolonged periods.
Exactly. Well, I go, oh, I was a bit tired on Sunday. And I went, what do we do on Saturday? I was like, oh, I was in loads of crowds of people.
Yeah,
I was like, we went to a nice Italian town, but there was a lot of people there. It was like me and my girlfriend were just kind of noticing. And this is embodied noticing, right? Like,
yeah,
oh, look, we're a bit more tired than normal. I wonder
yeah,
why that is. What have we been doing? And then you can learn, right? So without that awareness, there's no feedback loop to go,
yeah,
oh, maybe it took me ages to figure out that noisy taxis with the radio on did my head in and made me exhausted and irritable. And then
yeah,
even just background music very quietly made me a bit more irritable. And eventually someone pointed out, I was like, oh yeah. By the way, I destroyed my Uber rating doing this because I for about 2 years I'd ask Ubers to turn their music off and they'd say down and I go, no, off. And they some of them like I don't think some people can't handle silence. It's quite a common thing with traumatized people of certain cultures. Italians are like that, for example. They're just uncomfortable with silence. and I just destroyed my Uber rating. And eventually I got an email from literally I was just politely asking to turn the music off. And now you can click a thing where it's called comfort, where you pay a bit extra and you can ask for it. But it's like, be careful. Maybe I'm slamming doors. I was never like rude to anyone, I don't think. But anyway, be careful, because if you get banned from Uber, that's a real problem. So I thought 4.5 was a good Uber rating. Apparently that's terrible. 4.5 stars apparently is terrible. So I think I'm back up to 4.7 or something now. I'm doing okay. Anyway, that's an aside, bit of an ADHD tangent. Um, let's talk about dopamine. So I think another thing with ADHD people is dopamine doesn't function so well. So there tends to be issues with addiction.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of embodiment notices I have is, am I craving something? Am I
Yeah.
getting an addict for something? Like noticing those things. And there's always something.
Yeah.
There's always like, my girlfriend's got a joke about it now. It's like, what's the thing for this 6 months? I get obsessed with something, I hyperfixate. Now that can be great from a learning point of view if I get fixated. Remember when I was writing the book for young men?
Oh,
I
I
just
remember it very well, Mark.
absolutely manic, waking up in the morning at 5 a.m., like hyper fixated on it, and I got a book written in a relatively short space of time. So it's not all bad. My hyper fixation on embodiment techniques probably led to my entire career, right? But there's
Yes.
other addictions that, I'm long-term sober for a reason. I've
Yeah.
had issues with dating in ways that weren't healthy, that were compulsive. I've had issues around foods, technologies, social media. I was definitely unhealthily hooked on at one point. Crypto, which is effectively gambling, and there was some
Yes.
years like some of them have really done me a lot of damage, and some of them have done me a little bit of damage, and some of them have actually been positive.
Yes.
Right? But I
Yes.
think some of my little fixations, I mean, any fixation in a way is always damaging because it becomes obsessive. Let's take my last fixation. It's a bit geeky. So I was into painting Warhammer models. It's a very relaxing hobby. I think you encourage it because it's great for my nervous system, not on my phone. Very good hobby. And I started playing these games I played when I was a kid, so they're quite nice to get a hobby as a grown man, a bit of a geeky one. But then it pretty much like took over the house, and the entire table was covered in paint and stuff. My girlfriend's going crazy, right? And it's like, poor Lucia. And it's like, she's going crazy when she sees paints everywhere. And I must have bought like £2,000 worth of like models and paints and equipment. They gave me a special card in the arts and crafts supply shops to get a discount because I go in there so often. I was like the only guy in the arts and crafts shop. So even that, which is a relatively wholesome, healthy hobby, it went a little far. And then when we went to move house, my girlfriend's like, "Yeah, we need another truck just for
For
all
the
your
paints.
models and paints and stuff." And I'd taken like rocks and cones from the park to make into scenery, and it was just like, okay, so even a relatively wholesome hobby can be a bit out of control. So we've got a language for that now to talk about that. But what do you reckon the next one will be?
Oh, I never quite know. I mean, sometimes you can see them emerging quietly from the
Yeah,
side, but
yeah,
and I'm talking about you, right?
yeah.
Sometimes
Personally, yeah.
I can see them emerging and then they tail off and others gather pace. So I don't know. I wouldn't
It was the
like to.
gym for a while. I used to go to
It
the
was.
gym 3 hours a day,
Yeah.
5 days a week.
Yeah.
I mean, I still do the gym, but it's much more. I didn't have to quit that one like alcohol. It's much
Yeah.
more moderate now.
And maybe there's something in that because you can still paint your models, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to be more. I think you can either have to quit or you can just find a more moderate. And it's interesting
Yeah.
because when I come out of that, I feel like, why was I so obsessed with that? I was like, why did I spend so much money on that? Why did I spend so much time on that? I just go, that was mental. It was clearly mental. You can't tell me when I'm there. What I think is, we are ADHD people are prone to addictions, and again, self-regulation strategies are really helpful around that. Um, yeah, one to watch out for, I would say.
Yeah, because anything beyond moderation has the potential for harm in some way, whether it's harm in relationships, financially, whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and not some of them really harmful. Like I just won't walk into a betting gambling place
Yeah.
ever. I just won't walk into one because I know that could just destroy me. But then
Yeah.
equally, there's like investments I've made that I thought you was like investing and it was more gambling, really.
Yeah.
So it can come out in other ways.
Yes.
Certainly my dating life, was out of control some years ago, quite a while back now, but it was out of control. And that was just like, yeah, okay, even being ethical and whatever can still lead to harm, can still lead to reputation damage and hurt
Yes.
feelings and all the rest of it. So, there's things I regret there. And yeah, I think, embodiment's definitely helpful. but equally embodiment can be the addiction. Like I know
Of
a lot of people
course.
with ADHD who are addicted to hot yoga. Let's what are the main culprits? Anything that alters your state strongly. Hot yoga. I've seen loads of friends in AA go to hot yoga like every day, and they do it every day.
Yeah.
Certain types of breath work,
I was going to say that breath work. Yeah.
a Kundalini yoga. I think all
Yep.
types of yoga potentially, but Kundalini yoga and hot yoga particularly. Conscious dance. I mean, it's called ecstatic dance for a reason. It alters your
Yep.
state, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
know people that go, even tango. They get the intimacy hit of tango, and they go 4 or 5 times a week. And tango milongas go to 1 or 2 in the morning. Like that
Yes.
can really affect your work and your life. So even
Yeah.
embodied practices that we might normally recommend, like weightlifting or tango or breath work, which are all good things, can be with an ADHD hyperfixation can be negative.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people lose the embodiment anchor within
Uh-huh.
that. So, some of the people I know that go to hot yoga, some of them lose awareness of body. It's
Well,
more
it's
about
just state
state.
shifting after a while,
Yes.
isn't it? It's a way of chasing a high, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where the addiction ADHD sort of crossover comes in. So, any embodiment people listening to this, like, do you do your practice primarily to get high? It's interesting. You can ask people, would you still do yoga if it felt bad? Or would you still do yoga if it made you fat? And they go because you can get to people's real motivations. Now, I'm not suggesting it's good to be obese, and it's nice that yoga makes you feel relaxed. But what's your primary reason for doing something? Like,
Yeah.
because people say, I go to the gym because I enjoy it. So I say, okay, so if it made you uglier, would you still go to the gym, even if you still enjoyed it? Like, well, not really. So it's like, okay, so now we find the actual motivation here, right? I mean, it's a thought experiment. I'm not suggesting
Yes.
this to do. But yeah, I think it's about being honest with ourselves in our embodied
Yes.
practices. Yeah. Good. Any more aspects we want to cover here in terms of ADHD and how it impacts in terms of I mean, obviously just talking about presence rather than being scattered in embodiment, that's a big one. Stress
Yeah.
management is a big one. Um, yeah, addiction, sensory perfection. I think we covered most of the areas we said we were
Yeah.
going to. Is there any on your list that you think need to be added?
No, but going back to that strong genetic base and, parents of kids with ADHD, it's not your fault,
Not your fault. You didn't just because you gave them too much McDonald's or something else. I mean,
Yeah.
diet may be a factor in there, but we don't think that's the. What do you think of
Yeah.
sugar? Have you got any opinions? Because some people say sugar's really bad for ADHD, other people don't say
It
it's not. I
depends on the
think the evidence
person.
is mixed, isn't it? The evidence base.
Yeah. I think it
Additives.
depends on the person. Some people are really sensitive to sugars. Some people, my husband used to say to his kids, have you been drinking blue something?
Yeah, additives. Well, as a kid, I used to have that as well. My mum, oh, you've had the E numbers again. There was
Yeah.
some very strong orange additive that used to make me go a bit mental. So I guess it's about testing there. We haven't talked about diet or supplements. I mean, I definitely find like a more grounding diet helpful. Fish oils work for a lot of people quite well, apparently. It's one I've taken for a while.
And there's some things about diet that's good for just about everybody, isn't there? You know,
Yeah, I mean, like a fish oil supplement was pro. I mean, so there's going to be someone listening saying, "Yeah, but what if they're rancid and you should take them with vitamin E?" That's what Alina told me. But it's basically like there's this pretty strong evidence base that they're good for your health. A
yeah.
zinc supplement, a magnesium supplement to help you sleep. I don't know. We don't give medical advice on here,
I,
but
and I don't take supplements. We just have a good range of fruit and vegetables, proteins and fats, and
I think that's
carbohydrates.
probably 90% of it. I've always been a pill popper, and I'm not convinced it's been good for me over the years to be such a pill popper. Good. Any other ADHD embodiment things while we're here? I think we covered the main
Mm.
ones.
I think we have. Find your practice. Find your practice that's not taking you to a place of being disembodied.
Okay, so yeah, so what are the takeaways? So takeaways are we don't give medical advice. Drugs can be a lifesaver for some people, but maybe look at with caution. There's different types of drugs out there that are not all the same category. Like Wellbutrin is not the same as what's the big brands around the amphetamine ones, the famous ones? It's the one in
Oh,
America that was talk about. Um,
Ritalin.
Adderall and Ritalin, yeah, Adderall in America, really. Okay. So, we'd say handle with care, but we don't want to say
Yeah.
never do them. Herbal remedies potentially out there. Exercise, I think, is one bit of advice we can give to anyone. If you have ADHD and you're not exercising, I'm like, don't complain to me. Don't come to therapy. Like that should just be like, come on, basic, absolutely basic. Meditation may be very hard at first, but can be little and often and dosed up to be helpful. Though bear
And
in mind,
following
it
movement.
may say again.
And following movement.
Yeah, following movement. There's different, different times of day. I just built it up personally, but it's yeah. So it can be. Don't say I can't meditate. I've got ADHD, but equally, if you try and sit down on a Vipassana retreat and you've never done it before and you've got ADHD, it's going to be torture. You're just going to not enjoy that. Yeah, find a practice which is good for your ADHD, which isn't obsessive or addictive or overly state changing or making you compromise. Here's the thing with an addiction: is it costing more than it's giving?
Yeah.
Right, in terms of time, money, energy. Like even that, that Warhammer hobby I talked about, it ended up costing a bit more money and time and mess in the house than I thought it would. The other one is, does it reduce, do you do something unethical for it? So in the case of the Warhammer, I didn't, right? But
Yeah.
in the case of other addictions like alcohol, I would lie, I would be, I would hurt myself and others. Like anything that's unethical is usually a sign, okay, then it's now controlling you. You
Yes.
do it when you say you're not going to do it and it hurts what you care about. That's a
Yeah.
definition for me of addiction. Maybe one of those two or both of those criteria. So it's either
Mhm.
compulsive or it's damaging other things in your life.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that's worth looking at for ADHD people, particularly because it is whack-a-mole. It does pop up in other areas. You can train the attention to improve, though it might be different for other people's. Movement is key. Oh, and making changes in your environment, like the music or the fabrics or the household,
Yeah.
helping other people understand as well. Like I'll tell colleagues, I said to someone today, I said, don't send me a 5-minute voice message. I said 1 minute or less. If you've got points you want me to respond to, put them in a separate message, chunk it down for me. I'll tell colleagues like, hey, sometimes I don't listen that well. It's not an excuse. If you really need me to listen, ask me, but I'm not a natural. Like, and if you listen to this podcast, for example, I was way worse at listening to guests back at the beginning. Now, ones with you are a bit different because it's mostly me talking, and we know that, and that's the format. And Helen has her own ones privately as well. But like, if you listen to me now, I'm way better at listening and not interrupting than I
Yeah.
start 8 years ago. We just had an eighth
Yep.
anniversary for the podcast, and that is trainable. So it's no point. I think it's a good point to say as well that we shouldn't use our conditions as excuses. I mean, if I had just said, "Oh, I've got ADHD, so I'm going to interrupt all my guests on the podcast," but it's not an excuse. Like I trained myself to get better. I got better at not, and I'm still not perfect. I might still be a 6 out of 10 and not a 10 out of 10. I'm never going to be a counselor, I don't think. But I'm definitely improved if you listen to old podcasts. And that was because I
Because of your
consciously.
your intention to
Yeah.
improve.
Yeah, and I didn't say, "Oh, it's my ADHD. It's an excuse." And I do see people doing that now.
Yeah.
They'll say it's an excuse. I
Yeah.
also worry, like, for example, if I'm constantly trying to cut out noise, does that make it worse? You just get more and more sensitive to it. So it's like I try and sometimes, it doesn't matter if there's a bit of noise around. I'm not going to freak out about this. I think there, yeah.
I think
Final
that's a good
thoughts?
point, actually. The sensitivities, embracing them a little bit at the edges. It's pushing at the edges again, isn't it?
Mm.
Pushing at the
Mm.
edges.
It was also
Yeah.
choice today. There was um some sort of noise outside. I think they were doing work on the house next door, and Lucia talked to them and said, "Oh, just going to be an hour." And I went, "You know what? I can deal with this for an hour. It's not going to interrupt my work. It's not going to exhaust me." And just not choosing not to be a bit precious about it. You know what I mean? Like people say, "Now I'm sensitive." Like that's a good thing, and it's like, well, I think sensitive is also sort of an insult for a reason, right? Because it usually means tetchy would be the British word. Sorry for foreign listeners. Tetchy is like sensitive in a bad way, right? Highly sensitive people are sometimes sensitive and they're sometimes just a bit tetchy and they need to deal with it. So there we go. On that unempathic note, yeah, I think we got some good takeaways there. Hopefully that was useful. Now I'm ADHD rambling, so that's my excuse. I'm going to stick with it. Thanks, Helen, for being my
Thank
sounding
you.
board and your input as ever.